inheritance, only to find when checking the literature that Mendel had anticipated them by 35 years earlier. There are actually two theses consisting this narrative. One is the long neglect thesis. Part of the story is Mendel's work was completely neglected or ignored until 1900. And the other part of the story actually is De Vries, Correns, and Chermat all independently rediscover Mendel's law of inheritance. In a sense, they happen to read Mendel's paper after they finish their research or the majority of their research. So let's just take a look at what they said in their original papers. De Vries actually published 4 papers about that story or that study in 1900, and this is from his German paper published in April. And in a footnote, De Vries put in this way: Mendel's paper is so seldom cited, and myself, for the first time, came to know that only after I closed the majority of my experiment. Okay, so that's De Vries. And similarly, Correns' account is like this: I thought I found something new, but I convinced myself Mendel had not only obtained the same result from experiments on peas, but as well as the explanation I found. Okay, so Correns highlighted he used to discover not just these interesting 3-to-1 Mendelian ratios, but also the explanation of these ratios. Chermat put a similar story like, even after the second year of my experiments, I still believe I found something new. Unfortunately, someone pointed out to me, and I read Mendel's paper. So that's just a story. Yeah, I can't claim the priority, but actually, if we just take a look at a non-neglect thesis, we will find actually it's problematic. We've got very good evidence to show, and even if you like, you can check about this. There are at least 12 citations or references to Mendel before 1900. Of course, from a contemporary point of view, 35 years, 12 citations, not a lot, but it's still, it suggests that actually it's not neglected, right? And if we take a close look at all these citations, and some of them not just merely cited Mendel. For example, Schmerhausen, in his dissertation submitted to St. Petersburg University, in which he made a very detailed and careful analysis of Mendel's paper. And that's just a very good evidence of that. And Mendel's work was actually well known, especially within the study of hybridization. Look at the title of the dissertation, that is On-plant hybrids, observations from St. Petersburg. Okay, so in other words, the non-neglect thesis was problematic or undermined. Now let's move on to the rediscovery thesis. First of all, let's just have a quick recap of what actually Mendel did in his paper. Mendel did have some laws, but they are not laws of inheritance. Okay, actually, if you read his German paper, you can't find the word vererben, that's a German word for inheritance of heredity. He only used the verb vererbet, means inherited, once. Okay, so the key word is development. So Mendel had 3 laws of development. And the first 2 laws are actually just so you're quite familiar with, just 3-to-1 ratio, or the 9-to-3 to 3-to-1 ratio, just quite descriptive about the patterns of the inherited characteristics. And the third law actually provides reductive explanation of the first 2 laws. So that's what Mendel had in his paper. Now let's just examine these so-called rediscoverers' account of their rediscovery stories one by one. De Vries. Actually, De Vries' claims on his rediscovery story were quite inconsistent. For sometimes in his early 1900 papers, he just said, okay, actually I read Mendel's paper sometime after 1896, after completion of the experiments on poppy plants. And sometimes, for example, in a letter to Bailey, he mentioned, actually, I knew Mendel, I came to know Mendel's paper just because of your 1892 paper. And later on, about 20 years later, and in a letter to Roberts, he also mentioned, actually, no, I knew Mendel. I came to know Mendel's paper just because Bailey's 1895 book. Not only there are so many inconsistencies about his memory and record accounts, actually, there's something wrong about his memory. For example, in Bailey's 1895 book, you can't find the reference of Mendel. And even in the 1892 papers, personally, I found two different printings. One of them didn't mention Mendel at all. So I'm not quite sure which printing actually De Vries had. So that's already dubious. And it is even more dubious if you take a look at De Vries' papers. What you found? The famous Mendelian ratio 3:1. You can only find them explicitly stated after 1900. Before 1900, for example, the same plants in 1897, he just implicitly suggests actually there was a 2:1 ratio. If De Vries read Mendel before that, definitely he won't put that ratio there, right? Definitely not 2:1 if he discovered these ratio independently or even read Mendel at the time. So let's just quickly sum up. There are 3 points I should make about De Vries' rediscovered story. The first, you hardly can find any 3:1 or 1:2:1 Mendelian ratios explicitly stated in his pre-1900 publications. Secondly, you will find a very peculiar phenomena. In 1900, De Vries is suddenly starting using Mendelian terms, dominant, recessive. Before that, he got his own terminology, for example, active and latent, but not a dominant recessive. Why he suddenly used that, right? And the other phenomena was actually in his pre-1900 publications, he never explicitly articulate the Mendelian mechanism of a paired characteristics, for example, 2 capital A to small a during the productive process, they just split out and recombine. He didn't mention that process at all in his pre-1900 publications. So these just, I won't say these evidence is actually decisive to undermine, but definitely cause a serious doubt on his account of his rediscovered story. Now let's move on to Coran's, and this is Coran's own account about when and how he discovered independently the explanation of these interesting ratios. He said, in the autumn of 1899, I found the explanation, and it came to me just at once like a flash. And I only read Mendel's paper weeks after. Okay, so it seems like that's a very nice story. But unfortunately, we found something in the archive in Berlin. This is a note or entry you can find, written by Coran himself. And this note dated 16th of August, 1896. Look at Mendel, look, 66, right? So in other words, Coran's knew Mendel's work at least in 1896, 3 years earlier than he acknowledged when he read Mendel. I don't think we will just talk more about that. Let's move on to Chermat. And Chermat's account is like this. In the autumn of 1899, I just volunteered to a department and then get access to the library and found Folk's book, and in which I just noted, actually there's a reference to Mendel. Wow, that's quite interesting, and I believe. And then actually I was disappointed because the regular relationships discovered by May, that is 3:1 ratio, actually found it already discovered 35 years earlier by Mendel. Okay, still actually I believed I found something new, but it was not. Chermat's claim was the least well received among historians. For example, in 1966, His paper was not even included in the famous book, Stern and Sherwood edited volume, The Origin of Genetics. And they just made such a judgment. Chermat's publication in 1900, actually, he has lack of the sufficient understanding to show, actually, he made that discovery. Okay, and the other thing, what I spotted quite interesting is Chermat highlighted what he really discovered was just the regular relationship, that is just the ratio itself. Rather than explanation, he didn't provide any explanation of these ratio, why they're 3-to-1. Chermat didn't mention that. And even more dubiously, for Chermat, he claimed he observed some important Mendelian ratios, for example, 1-to-1. I won't go into detail of that, but what I can tell you is it was not stated explicitly in his 1900 paper. Okay, so if you still, actually, I still fail to convince you these stories are problematic, there's one more argument for you. That is, if you take a look at Mendel's paper, as I just mentioned, Mendel's work was not about heredity. If you just search keywords, you cannot find keyword inheritance. There's no occurrence of the word inheritance of forever, but you can find other words like hybrids 110 times and development 44 times. So Mendel's work was literally about hybrid development in their progeny. Right? So what did not happen? Now I can conclude Mendel's work was not neglected, and until 900, and Mendel's law was not rediscovered because Mendel's law was about development. It's not laws about inheritance. So it's from a logical point of view, you can't just discover something that doesn't exist, right? Now let's just move on to take a look at what did happen, right? Otherwise you will be disappointed if I tell you something all about a negative account. Let's starting with De Vries again. Who was De Vries? De Vries, and what was De Vries doing, especially in the 19th century? De Vries was working on the problem of heredity. He got his own theory of pangenesis. That theory was first proposed by Darwin, but De Vries further developed that. And one of the key puzzles De Vries encountered at the time was that theory was hardly experimentally testable. So he spent the whole decade trying to test the theory of pangenesis. And in his 1900 paper, he explicitly stated that the law of segregation he could discover Mendel provides some evidential support of his theory of pangenesis. And he still worked really hard on that project in the following years. For example, in his 1903 book, you may find he's still trying to incorporate Mendel's approach with his study, especially his theory of pangenesis. Unfortunately, he failed, and he could abandon that Mendelian project afterwards. Okay. Then Corin's, if you take a look at Corin's paper, you find it very clear, and his paper read just like a report. And he also made that very clear. This paper trying to test Mendel's work on Pison, and he followed Mendel's experimental procedures step by step and using Mendelian concepts. Of course, it's fair to say the significance of Corin's paper was not just a mere confirmation. He also made some efforts trying to incorporate Mendel's work with Weissman's work. For example, he tried to reformulate Mendel's rule in terms of N lager, which is proposed by Weissman. Okay. And also, I would like to make a fair point on Chermat. Chermat is definitely more than an experimenter at the time. He was also what I call a theorist trying to conceptualize the 3-to-1 ratio in his very distinctive concept, valence of traits. And he tried to develop his own theory of heredity with his brother, Armin von Chermat. Unfortunately, he didn't work this out, but nevertheless, we still can understand Chermat's work in 1900 as an incorporation of Mendel's approach into his analysis of valency of traits in heredity. Okay. So what in fact happened in 1900? And in short, we can summarize as that was the time Mendel's work was introduced to the study of heredity. And also there are 3 different attempts trying to incorporate Mendel's approach to the study of heredity. And this point also confirmed by these 1900 rediscovery papers. For example, de Vries make that point that the law of segregation as discovered by Mendel for peace has a basic significance for the study of the units of heredity. In a similar way, Chermat put in such a way, the principle established by Mendel proves to be of the highest significance for the study of inheritance in general. Okay, so this is the first time Mendel's work, the significant Mendel's work for the study of heredity was appreciated or recognized. Okay, now I would like to wrap things up. So what was why the year 1900 so important? What did that mean to the study of heredity? I won't say it's about history of genetics, because the word genetics was coined by William Bason in 1905 in a letter to his friend, and the concept gene was introduced by Danish biologist Johansen in 1909, 9 years later. But it's fairly clear the year 1900 was really important for Mendel, even he's already died 14 years before, but definitely important for his work, and also important for the study of heredity at the time. His work was introduced and incorporated by de Vries, Horens, and Chermat. And what is more important, that just opened a new page for the history of study of heredity. For example, a new Mendelian approach was soon developed and defended by William Bason and his associates, mainly based in Cambridge. And that line of inquiry quickly developed and moved on to a further incorporation with the prominent theory, and end up with what we know, the Morgan School, the classical genetics in 1910s. In short, the year 1900 just marks the beginning of a new episode of the history of genetics, just as George has mentioned, that the birth of genetics. Thank you very much for your attention.